The summer of 1838 burned hotter than memory itself. Georgia's air sat thick and swollen, heavy with the weight of cane fields ripening under the sun. The plantation seemed to breathe sickness, the stench of sweat, the sweet, sour tang of fermenting syrup, and the metallic undertone of iron tools left to rust in damp soil. Even the insects moved sluggishly, drunk on heat and sugar. Inside the kitchen house, the air pressed down heavier still, a stew of boiling pots and sticky barrels that stood in the shadows like dark coffins, each filled with molasses so dense it seemed to swallow light whole. Rebecca stood among them, silent as she worked. Her skin glistened with sweat, arms moving in steady rhythm as she scraped the kettle's sides, ladled syrup, wiped spills. To the family that owned her, she was invisible, another shadow among the barrels. She kept her head bowed, voice quiet, movements careful enough to leave no mark. Years of survival had taught her the lesson that silence was safer than speech, stillness stronger than resistance. To them, she was obedience personified, but silence is not always submission. In Rebecca's stillness lived calculation. Her eyes flicked when no one watched, measuring the room, the barrels, the door. She knew how long it took syrup to boil, how long before the scalding surface cooled to the touch, how heavy each barrel's lid felt when lifted. She had learned these things not from duty, but from instinct, as though her hands were sketching a map while her lips never parted. The mistress of the house, Margaret Weatherby, entered often with her cloying perfume of lavender and sweat. Margaret was a woman who spoke softly and struck cruelly. She left no welts of her own making, no lash laid across Rebecca's back by her own hand, but she cut deeper with the lash of humiliation, wielding cruelty in whispers and punishments cloaked in piety. She was quick to invoke scripture, quicker still to twist it. Rebecca had once seen her burn a page from a slave's pocket Bible, saying God needed no scripture carried in the hands of heathens. She would smile as she punished, lips pale and tight, as though discipline were a righteous prayer. She believed herself merciful. That was her sin. Rebecca's silence was Margaret's triumph, or so Margaret thought. To the mistress, a bowed head meant submission, quiet meant agreement, and empty eyes meant emptier minds. But in the darkened kitchen, long after Margaret's footsteps faded, Rebecca's stillness shifted. She would raise her head then, eyes glinting against the dim glow of firelight, her mind circling like a hawk above a field. The barrels of molasses loomed over her at night, tall and mute. Some said molasses kept secrets better than the earth, that if a body fell into its depths, not even the worms could claim it. Whispers in the quarters had long called it black honey, both a sweetness and a curse. Rebecca listened to those whispers. She carried them the way she carried scars, hidden beneath sleeves, pressed down beneath silence. At daybreak, life in the quarters began with the crack of the overseer's voice, but in the kitchen house, Rebecca's chains were made of heat and watchfulness. She rose before the roosters to grind corn, fetch water, and stir the kettles until steam slicked her skin. Margaret would arrive in her crisp cotton gown, pale arms folded, nose wrinkled at the smell. "You stir too slow, Rebecca," she would remark, voice like the scrape of a blade over bone. "Do you mean to waste my husband's sugar? Do you mean to shame me before our guests?" Rebecca would bow her head lower, hands moving faster, eyes never meeting Margaret's. She would murmur the single word that kept her alive. "Yes, ma'am." But in her heart, the words turned bitter, molasses thick, not for long. Rebecca's world was a rhythm of duties layered with silence. Each task, polishing silver, carrying platters, scrubbing floors, was done with the same precision as a ritual. She knew that a clumsy step meant humiliation, a late answer meant hunger, and any spark of defiance meant pain. Yet she bore it with an expression carved from stone. The other enslaved whispered about her, called her ghost-like, too quiet to be trusted, too watchful to be safe. Still, they noticed the way she remembered everything, where the master kept his keys, how the mistress's voice quavered when she lied, how the syrup clung to Margaret's dresses longer than water ever would. There was power in watching. By night, Rebecca's thoughts turned inward. She lay on her cot, listening to the creak of the rafters, the cries of whippoorwills beyond the cane fields, and the faint hum of molasses shifting in its barrels like a slow tide. In those hours, her silence hardened into something sharper. The memory of her brother Jonah's death, beaten after Margaret's false accusation of theft, smoldered behind her eyes. It had been Margaret's voice, gentle as milk, that condemned him. "He looked at me wrong. He's not safe." The overseers had carried out the sentence, but the spark was hers. Jonah's blood soaked the dirt, but Margaret's hands stayed white. Rebecca never forgot. She carried that memory like an ember beneath ash, burning quietly, waiting for air. The kitchen itself became a place of dual lives. In the daylight, it was a chamber of service, filled with orders barked, pots scraped, and Margaret's disapproving sighs. At night, it was a sanctum where Rebecca's silence grew teeth. The barrels of molasses loomed like sentinels, their dark surfaces gleaming in the firelight. She would trail her fingers over one lid, feeling the weight of it, imagining the world beneath, a thick, suffocating blackness that swallowed everything. She did not smile, not even then, but her silence deepened, solidified. It was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of a storm gathering. Outside, the plantation slept under its crown of cane. Inside, Rebecca's eyes opened wide in the dark, gleaming like coals. Her stillness was no longer survival alone. It was preparation. And the barrels, lined up like coffins in the shadows, waited with her. By daylight, Margaret Weatherby wore her cruelty like lace, threaded through everything, delicate enough to pass for refinement, sharp enough to cut flesh without leaving her fingerprints behind. Where her husband raged openly, and the overseers cracked whips in the fields, Margaret preferred smaller instruments. The plate left empty, the prayer twisted into mockery, the humiliation staged behind closed doors. Rebecca knew her methods well. On Sundays, Margaret held her own service in the parlor, pressing the enslaved into stiff rows while she recited scripture with her hand upon the good book. "Obey your masters in all things," she would say, her voice smooth, the words rolling like polished stones. But her piety was a mask stretched thin over her malice. When she discovered Rebecca had kept a worn Bible, a gift passed down from her mother, she ordered it brought to the hearth. Before Rebecca's eyes, Margaret fed it to the fire, page by page, the ink curling into smoke. "You will hear the word from me alone," she said, smiling faintly as the last page crumbled. "The Lord has no need of heathens carrying his scripture in secret." That night, Rebecca lay awake, the smell of burned paper still in her nose, the image of curling pages etched into her memory. Her silence held steady, but her calm grew heavier. Food was Margaret's favorite punishment. A missed stitch in a gown, a platter placed too far from her chair, a single word spoken too slowly. Each offense meant Rebecca would eat nothing that day. She was forced to stand close to the hearth, serving Margaret's food with smoke in her lungs and hunger twisting her belly, while the mistress dined in comfort. Margaret would nibble roasted chicken or spoon syrupy, putting into her mouth while Rebecca stood bare, armed in the heat, her stomach clawing itself from the inside. "Perhaps you'll learn," Margaret would say softly, her fork clinking against the china. "Hunger is a fine teacher for idle hands." Rebecca bowed her head lower each time, hands steady, voice gone still. Yet inside, a slow tide pressed forward, black and thick. Her cruelty did not stop with deprivation. Margaret rarely ordered a whip herself, but her words were as good as leather on flesh. She whispered to overseers about carelessness, about bad attitudes, about eyes that lingered too long. The overseers responded with fists and lashings, never asking questions. Rebecca had learned that Margaret's accusations were often whims, born of her sour moods, her envy, her need to remind herself of power. It was Margaret's whim that had cost Jonah his life. Jonah had been only 16, with strong shoulders and a quick smile that flickered even in hard times. Rebecca remembered his laughter while hauling water, his habit of humming as he patched baskets in the evening. Margaret had stopped him one morning in the yard, her lips pursed. "He looked at me wrong," she told the overseer. "He's not safe." The accusation was enough. Jonah was dragged out, beaten with fists and boots until his breath stilled, his body broken. Rebecca had watched from the kitchen door, her heart a stone, her voice frozen in her throat. Margaret had stood nearby, dabbing her temples with a kerchief, not once glancing toward the boy's body. That night, Rebecca buried Jonah in her dreams, not the earth, for even his grave was denied dignity. From that day forward, her silence became something different. It was no longer merely survival. It was mourning disguised as obedience, grief pressed into stillness, rage hidden under ash. The other enslaved noticed the change. "She don't cry," they whispered. "She don't scream." Some feared her distance, others drew strength from it. Rebecca herself did not speak of Jonah, not even when alone, but his death clung to her as tightly as the scarred burns on her arms. Every kindness denied, every bite of food withheld, every whispered accusation piled atop his memory until her silence threatened to crack. And yet, outwardly, she remained the same, bowed, careful, invisible. Omens began to creep into her nights. She dreamed of rivers that ran black and thick, swallowing moonlight whole. In those dreams, voices rose from beneath the surface, low murmurs, as though the river itself whispered secrets only she could hear. Sometimes she awoke to find her palms sticky with sweat, as if she had dipped them in syrup. In the cane fields, wind carried strange sounds through the stalks. At dusk, when the workers trudged back, Rebecca would pause to listen. The whispers rose again, half wind, half memory, speaking in tones she could not understand but felt in her bones. They told her of patience, of slow suffocation, of sweetness that could turn to death. Each day, as she worked in the kitchen, the barrels of molasses loomed nearer in her mind. They lined the walls like a row of silent jurors, waiting for judgment. Their surfaces caught the firelight, glossy and dark, reflections shifting with each flicker. To others, they were simply storage, sugar thickened for shipment. To Rebecca, they had become symbols, patience made solid, punishment made sweet, silence made suffocating. She found herself lingering by them after tasks were done, brushing her fingertips against their lids. The weight was familiar, the wood grain rough against her skin. She imagined the blackness beneath, how it would cling to anything dropped within, how it would smother air and sound alike. Each night the thought grew stronger. The barrels were not only containers. They were coffins waiting to be filled. Margaret never noticed the way Rebecca's eyes flickered toward them. She never thought her cruelty required watching. To Margaret, Rebecca was nothing but silence and service, a shadow trained to bow. But within that silence lived something Margaret could not comprehend, memory, patience, and rage fermenting as slowly and surely as syrup thickening in heat. Rebecca's grief had not broken her. It had reshaped her. And the molasses barrels, patient as time, whispered promises each night. that even sweetness can suffocate, that even silence can kill. The kitchen had always been Rebecca's cage, but that day it became her crucible. The punishment came swiftly, like all of Margaret Weatherby's cruelties, delivered with the softness of a prayer and the precision of a blade. The mistress had been hosting guests, her voice light with laughter, when a drop of molasses slipped from Rebecca's ladle and struck the hem of her white dress. It was nothing, no larger than a coin, no darker than a shadow, but Margaret's eyes narrowed as if Rebecca had poured blood upon her. "Clumsy creature," she murmured, setting down her spoon. "Do you think I wear rags fit for your spills?" Rebecca lowered her head, murmuring apology, but Margaret was already standing, already reaching for judgment. She gestured to the kettle, its surface boiling, its syrup roiling like molten tar. "Dip your arms," she said softly, "and learn what carelessness costs." Rebecca froze. The kitchen seemed to tilt. Heat rose in waves, carrying the scent of sugar gone bitter. The other servants lowered their eyes, none dared move. Margaret's smile flickered, thin and cruel. "Now," she commanded. Rebecca stepped forward, her heart steady, her breath shallow. She lowered her arms into the steam until the boiling molasses licked her skin. Agony seared through her flesh, blistering, tearing. The sound was soft but dreadful, the hiss of flesh against sugar. Margaret's eyes glittered with satisfaction, expecting screams, begging tears. But Rebecca gave her nothing. She did not scream. She did not beg. Her eyes lifted, locking on Margaret's pale face with a silence deeper than any cry. It was not submission in her gaze, but defiance. Cold, steady, eternal. Margaret faltered for a heartbeat, unsettled by the absence of pain's music. Then she turned away, dismissing Rebecca with a flick of her hand as though nothing had passed. That night, Rebecca sat alone in the kitchen. The skin of her arms was blistered and raw, her muscles trembling, but her silence held. Before her loomed the great barrel of molasses set aside for shipment, taller than a man, sealed with iron hoops. Firelight caught its glossy rim, casting it into a thing both ordinary and monstrous. She stared at it for a long time, her breath slow, her burned arms resting in her lap. It was no longer food to her eyes. It was a grave. She imagined Margaret leaning over it, her fine dress brushing against the rim, her pale throat exposed. She imagined the shove, the flailing, the syrup closing over her face like a black tide. She imagined the silence as the air disappeared, the syrup swallowing sound, breath, life. The vision burned brighter than the pain in her arms. Rebecca's silence hardened that night into resolve. She began her preparations slowly, carefully, the way syrup thickens drop by drop. When she was left alone in the kitchen, she tested the weight of the lid, lifting it an inch before setting it back with a soft thud. She studied the nails hammered into the barrel's rim, their strength, their looseness. She measured with her eyes how far a body might sink, how heavy the syrup pressed down on air. Each discovery she folded into her silence. Rebecca knew patience better than anyone. She had learned it in hunger, in grief, in watching her brother Jonah's blood soak the ground. She learned it now in firelit hours, her arms aching, her breath steady. She was patient as the molasses itself, slow, clinging, unrelenting. While others dreamed of escape, whispered of running north under night skies, Rebecca dreamed differently. She did not imagine flight. She imagined drowning Margaret in the very sweetness she had weaponized, turning the mistress's favorite indulgence into her tomb. The barrels became companions in her silence. Each one seemed to breathe in the dark, the syrup shifting within like a tide against unseen shores. At night, she thought she could hear them whisper, low, heavy murmurs, like the sound of a river dragging stones. They told her to wait. They told her that vengeance, like syrup, must be thickened with time. Rebecca listened. The others in the quarters noticed her more in those days. They saw the burns on her arms, the way she worked without complaint, the way her eyes seemed deeper, sharper. Some whispered she had gone cold, that the mistress had broken her spirit. Others shook their heads, saying nothing could break a woman who did not scream when her flesh burned. They did not know the truth. Rebecca had crossed a threshold. Pain no longer bent her. It shaped her. In her dreams, she no longer saw rivers alone. She saw Margaret's face reflected in them, pale and terrified, swallowed by black currents. She woke with her heart steady, her lips pressed thin, her silence thick as syrup. Days bled into weeks. Margaret's cruelties continued. Whispers to overseers, withheld meals, prayers turned to mockery. But Rebecca no longer absorbed them as wounds. She stored them like seeds in the dark soil of her silence, each one sprouting into something sharper. Every glance at the great barrel reminded her patience was not weakness. It was strategy. Her arms healed slowly, scars puckering along her skin, the flesh tender but unyielding. Each scar was a reminder, each mark a promise. Margaret had meant to break her with fire, but instead she had carved her into stone. The kitchen became Rebecca's temple of patience, the barrels her silent altar. Each night she lingered by them, fingertips brushing the wood, breath measured. She imagined Margaret's voice muffled under the syrup, her final prayers drowned in sweetness that turned to horror. And she waited. Waited as the molasses thickened, as the days shortened, as whispers in the cane fields grew louder at dusk. Waited until the time would come when patience could turn to action. Rebecca's silence was no longer survival. It was a weapon, sharpened by fire, tempered in grief, waiting to strike. And in the shadows of the kitchen, the barrels stood ready, black, patient, eternal. The night of the feast arrived heavy with heat and pomp. Lanterns glowed along the veranda, moths circling their flames, while the dining room shone with polished silver and laughter. Margaret Weatherby presided over it all with the smug air of a queen at court, her lips stretched thin into a smile that never reached her eyes. For her guests, wealthy neighbors from surrounding plantations, she offered delicacies of roasted game, sugared peaches, and steaming cornbread. But the centerpiece of her pride was not the food. It was Rebecca. Margaret paraded her like one might display a finely trained hound, speaking of her skill in the kitchen as though Rebecca were not flesh and blood, but some tool she had crafted with her own hands. "So obedient, so capable," she purred, nodding toward Rebecca as she moved between the table and the sideboard, sleeves drawn long to hide the scars still healing beneath. "The Lord blesses us when his servants learn their place." Rebecca kept her head bowed, her steps steady, her silence unbroken. Beneath the sleeves, her arms throbbed with old pain. She balanced platters with practiced grace, placing them before the guests as Margaret soaked in their admiration. Each word spoken about Rebecca passed through the air like smoke, obedient, quiet, useful. None of them saw the embers smoldering behind her lowered gaze. Wine flowed freely. The room grew warm with laughter and self-satisfaction. Rebecca moved unnoticed among them, the silent current beneath their revelry, until the accident. As she leaned forward to place a dish, the rim of a molasses jug brushed the edge of the table. A dark ribbon of syrup slithered down, dripping onto the polished floorboards with a slow, sticky sound. The room went still for a heartbeat. Then Margaret's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Rebecca!" Rebecca froze, the tray balanced in her hands. Margaret's eyes glittered in triumph, not outrage. The mistress rose slightly, her hand raised for her guest's attention. "Look here," she said sweetly. "When the help makes a mess, the help cleans it. On your knees, girl, lick it clean. The room erupted in laughter, harsh, bright, cruel. Forks tapped against plates. A man's voice drawled, "Make her do it proper, Maggie." Another woman tittered behind her gloved hand. Rebecca lowered the tray, knelt slowly, and bent her head toward the floor. The molasses glistened before her like a dark mirror. She leaned close enough that her breath stirred its surface. The laughter rolled above her, echoing against the rafters, but Rebecca heard none of it. In her mind, the image reversed, not her lips near the sticky darkness, but Margaret's face plunging into it, pale and frantic, swallowed whole. She licked once, slowly, tasting bitterness under sweetness. She rose without a word, eyes lowered, her silence sharper than any curse. Margaret beamed, delighted with her own cruelty, basking in the laughter of her peers. But Rebecca's silence no longer bowed. It sharpened. It calcified. The night wore on. Guests drank deeply, their voices rising, their steps unsteady. Margaret glided among them, pleased with her spectacle. At last, the revelry staggered into silence as wine claimed its toll. Doors shut, candles guttered, and the house sank into drunken slumber. Rebecca remained awake. She sat in the kitchen, fire low, listening to the house's breathing, the groans of wood, the settling sighs of sleepers. Her eyes never left the great barrel of molasses set aside for shipment, its iron hoops glinting in the dim light. She did not dream tonight. She planned. When the hour was deep, she rose and walked quietly through the hall. She tapped gently at Margaret's chamber door. "Mistress," she whispered, "there's a noise in the kitchen. I feared it might be thieves." Margaret stirred, her vanity stronger than her drowsiness. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and followed, murmuring irritation. "At this hour, honestly, Rebecca, you—" The kitchen was dark except for the fire's glow. The great barrel stood in its corner, silent, looming. Rebecca gestured toward it, her face smooth as stone. "I heard something there," she said softly. Margaret, suspicious and curious, stepped forward. She bent, peering at the sealed lid, her fingers brushing the rim. "Nonsense," she muttered. "It's only—" Rebecca's hand struck with the certainty of years contained in silence. One sharp shove, cold and precise. Margaret gasped, arms flailing as she pitched forward. Her hands struck the rim, her body teetered, then toppled headfirst into the open barrel. The sound was grotesque, a wet, heavy plunge, syrup shifting like a tidal wave. Margaret's muffled screams bubbled, strangled by the thick blackness. She kicked, her silk slippers drumming against the barrel's side. Her arms flailed, striking wood, clawing air. But molasses is patient. It does not yield to thrashing. It clings. It smothers. Each movement dragged Margaret deeper, her cries swallowed, her lungs sealed by sweetness turned to horror. Rebecca stood unmoving, her face blank, her silence vast. She watched as the flailing slowed, as the thuds weakened, as the sticky tide swallowed every sound. The room filled with nothing but the low gurgle of syrup shifting back to stillness. When it was over, the barrel gleamed as before, surface dark and smooth, as though nothing had disturbed it. Only the faint ripple marked where Margaret had gone. Rebecca lowered the lid slowly, pressing it down until the nails caught, sealing the grave. Her burned arms throbbed, but she did not falter. She stepped back, the firelight flickering across her face, and for the first time in years, her silence did not feel like survival. It felt like justice. The kitchen returned to its hush, heavy with molasses and smoke. Outside, the cane fields whispered in the night, carrying secrets only Rebecca understood. The feast was ended. Margaret's laughter silenced. And in the sugar-slick silence of the kitchen, Rebecca's patience bore its fruit. Morning rose sluggish and gray over the plantation. The air clung damp to the earth, heavy with the smell of cane and wood smoke. In the great house, silence broke into shouts. Margaret Weatherby was missing. Her bed lay empty, her Bible unopened, her comb still resting on the vanity. But near the kitchen door, the hem of her fine dress had left a faint trace, a smear of darkness like tar, sticky against the floorboards. One of her slippers was found overturned, its silk strap crusted with syrup. The house roared with confusion. Servants scurried, overseers cursed. The master himself stumbled through hallways, pale and furious. "Find her," he cried. "Bring lanterns, call the dogs." Rebecca moved quietly through the chaos, ladling broth into bowls, sweeping ash from the hearth, her head bowed as though none of it touched her. Her sleeves still hid the scars on her arms. She neither offered questions nor answered them. When asked if she had seen Margaret in the night, her lips parted only to murmur, "No, sir." Her eyes betrayed nothing. The dogs sniffed along the kitchen floor, noses pressed to the boards where syrup had dripped. They whined, confused, circling, then fell silent. Overseers pried open storerooms, dragged through the cane fields, thrust lanterns into the darkness. Yet no trace of Margaret was found. The barrel sat undisturbed in its corner, sealed once more. No one thought to question it. It was only molasses, food, not grave. Already, workers had begun ladling syrup into smaller containers for shipment. Each dip of the ladle sent a ripple across the surface, pressing Margaret's body deeper into the black silence below. The master grew restless, his face hollowed with sleeplessness. At night he claimed he heard her voice drifting from the kitchen, soft, weeping, the brush of skirts against stone. Once he swore he saw her pale hand upon the doorframe, vanishing when he reached for it. He grew afraid of his own house, muttering prayers under his breath, his eyes darting toward shadows. "God forgive us," he whispered once, clutching his kerchief as sweat dampened his brow. She lingers still." Rebecca kept her silence. Each dawn she lit the fire, stirred the kettles, swept the floors. To the household she appeared unchanged. But the enslaved in the quarters noticed a shift. They saw the stillness of her hands, the unbroken calm of her face, the way overseers' glares seemed to slide from her as if she were not flesh but stone. Whispers spread quickly. "She did it," they said under their breath. "Rebecca drowned her." Others shivered, afraid even to speak her name. Some feared the wrath that might follow, the lashings that might fall upon all. Yet others, those with scars of their own, those who had buried sons and daughters under Margaret's words, looked upon Rebecca differently. "She walked where none dared," an old man murmured in the dark. "She made silence stronger than the whip." The quarters grew restless with rumor. Some saw her as cursed, others as chosen. To many, she became something more than woman, something larger, cloaked in vengeance, a shadow queen who had used silence itself as weapon. The plantation itself seemed to rot under her act. Meat spoiled faster. Milk curdled in the pan. Rats gnawed through stores of cornmeal. The house that once rang with Margaret's voice now echoed with unease. Servants moved like ghosts, their eyes darting toward the kitchen as though the air itself held judgment. The master shouted more, prayed louder, but nothing steadied his trembling hands. Rebecca never faltered. She carried platters as before, bowed when addressed, slipped through shadows as silent as the syrup that clung to her mistress's drowned body. Each task was done with the precision of ritual, her silence unbroken, her calm deeper than fear. Sometimes at night when the house creaked and the cane fields whispered, Rebecca would sit in the kitchen alone, staring at the barrel that held her secret. The firelight flickered across its iron hoops, and she would think of Jonah, his laughter, his blood in the dirt, the silence forced upon him by Margaret's whim. She thought, too, of Margaret's final thrashing, muffled and slowed, swallowed by sweetness that had become death. Rebecca did not smile. She did not weep. She only breathed, steady as ever, her silence filling the room like smoke. In time, the master ceased searching. Margaret was said to have vanished, taken by God's judgment or by her own discontent. Neighbors whispered scandal, spinning tales of madness or infidelity, of ghosts or sudden flight. The truth lay sealed beneath syrup, shipped slowly in casks across rivers and roads, her body sinking deeper into black silence with each day. Rebecca alone carried the truth, and the whispers of the quarters carried her legend. The house of Weatherby, once proud, became uneasy ground. Laughter rarely filled it. The master walked its halls muttering prayers, overseers drank heavier, workers moved like shadows. It was as if Margaret's death had bled into the walls, and silence itself had grown heavier, thicker, more suffocating. And at the center of it all, Rebecca remained, silent, patient, unbroken. The house had been Margaret's kingdom. Now it was a house of black silence, ruled by the woman who never raised her voice, whose vengeance had been poured as slowly and surely as molasses itself. Weeks passed, and the search waned. Margaret Weatherby remained missing, her absence settling into the house like mildew, thick and suffocating. The overseers muttered of runaways and kidnappings, of thieves slipping into the house in the dead of night. Neighbors speculated that she had abandoned her husband, fleeing north with a secret lover. The master clung to his Bible, muttering that perhaps she had been taken by God or by the devil himself. But none dared speak of the barrel. When the time came, it was sealed tighter, hoisted onto the back of a wagon bound for the river. Horses strained as the great weight shifted, wheels groaning across the dirt road. Dark syrup leaked from the seams, dripping down the spokes, splattering the dust like blood. Children followed the wagon at a distance, whispering, "The mistress rides inside." The trail of black spots marked the road until the wagon disappeared beyond the cane fields. Rebecca watched from the kitchen doorway. Her face revealed nothing, but her breath was steady, her gaze unblinking. She did not look away until the wagon vanished into the haze. Only then did she turn back to the fire, lifting her spoon, stirring as she always had. Outwardly, life continued unchanged. Bow your head. Carry the trays. Stir the kettles. Silence remained her shield, but something beneath the surface had shifted forever. The chain of silence, long forced upon her, long used to bind her, was now her weapon. In silence, she had buried Margaret. In silence, she had broken the mistress's dominion. And in silence, she continued, each act of obedience concealing the victory that no lash or hunger could undo. The household remained uneasy. At night, dogs barked toward the cane fields, hackles raised though no intruder could be found. The master drank heavier, his eyes ringed with sleepless fear. "She lingers," he muttered once, staring into the empty parlor. "I hear her still." His prayers grew louder, his voice cracking, but no answer came. Whispers spread beyond the house, out into the quarters, out into the neighboring plantations. Margaret's disappearance became lore. Some swore she had drowned in her own syrup, dragged into the barrel by invisible hands. Others said she had been spirited away by the devil, claimed for her cruelty. Still others whispered she walked at night, her pale face smeared with molasses, her mouth gaping black, searching for the woman who had unmade her. Years passed. The Weatherby plantation began to falter. Harvests soured. Cane rotted in the fields before it could be cut. Barrels cracked, leaking syrup that attracted swarms of flies. The master's health declined. Overseers came and went like restless shadows. Slowly, the house that had once glittered with Margaret's feasts fell into disrepair. Its windows clouded, its shutters sagged, its walls moaned in the wind, but the story lived on. Locals began to say that anyone who ate molasses from Weatherby land would taste bitterness at the back of the tongue, as though sugared with death. Some claimed the syrup curdled in the mouth, thick and choking. Children were warned not to play near old barrels left abandoned in the cane sheds. A pale hand might reach up, elders whispered, and pull you down into the sweetness. Travelers passing through at dusk said they heard low moans drifting from the fields, the sound of someone drowning without water. Rebecca remained silent. She lived her days as she always had, stirring kettles, bowing her head. But in her heart, she knew she had unshackled something larger than vengeance. Margaret's cruelty had ended not with a lash or a rope, but with silence and sweetness turned into grave. Long after Rebecca's own days passed, her act lingered. The quarters remembered her not as broken, but as unbreakable. They spoke of her as the woman who made silence heavier than the whip, who turned molasses into a tomb, who proved that even the sweetest substance could suffocate cruelty itself. The Weatherby plantation fell to ruin. Its fields grew wild, its house sagged into shadow, its barrels rotted in the sheds. But the legend remained, carried on the tongues of children, sung low in the night by those who remembered. They called it the House of Black Silence, and they said that sweetness itself could become a weapon, that even sugar could turn bitter, that even molasses could become a grave. Rebecca's story endured not as history, but as warning, as folklore, as a testament whispered through generations, that cruelty can be drowned. That silence can strike. That sweetness, when thickened with patience, can carry vengeance to the grave. And so, in the cane fields of Georgia, where the air still clung with sugar and smoke, the legend of Rebecca lingered. A woman who spoke little, who bowed often, but who once pressed her enemy into the syrup of her own making and left behind a story that tasted forever of death. If this story held you in its silence, tell me, what do you think Rebecca's act means? Was it vengeance, justice, or survival? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let your voice be heard where hers could not. For more untold stories of resistance, cruelty, and justice, make sure to subscribe and join us next time as we uncover another shadow from history. And remember, even sweetness can turn bitter.